In this video, I thought I'd share with you some recent experiences we've had with tenants being uncooperative in providing access to their accommodation for minor maintenance repair work to be carried out. It is important that once you have got a tenant in place, that you just don't simply leave them to it. Remember, you do actually have a statutory duty to carry out regular maintenance visits under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985. So once a tenant is in place, it is important to keep communication channels open with them and to visit the property on a regular basis to make sure that they're looking after the property, and also that there aren't any minor maintenance issues that have occurred that they haven't yet reported to you that you need to address. It's really important to encourage tenants to communicate with you and report anything minor, which they might be prepared to put up with, but actually what they don't realise is that it could potentially become a much more serious and expensive problem for you to resolve at some point in the future. There are obviously other reasons why you and your contractors will need to access the property as well, the most common one being the annual gas safety certificate. Don't forget also that at some point during the tenancy, you'll need to carry out an electrical installation condition report by your electrician. You might also need an EPC, particularly if you are looking at getting some sort of grant for energy efficiency purposes. And you might also want to refinance your property at some point, in which case you'll need access for a valuation surveyor to visit the property. So you can see there are lots of reasons, not just best practice, for carrying out maintenance inspections at your property as to why you would need access. Now, I'm sure you all know we have a very stringent referencing process, so we do carefully vet all of our tenants before we let them into the property to reduce the risk of any rent arrears. So we make sure that they've got a good credit history, and we check their financial viability and all of their references. However, the referencing process does not necessarily assess how clean and tidy they're going to be. We do make an assessment during the application process about how quickly they communicate and how responsive they are to our requests during the application process, and this bodes well for the tenancy going ahead. However, over time, you may find that the tenant becomes less responsive and less communicative with you as time progresses into the tenancy. It's really important that you make every effort to make sure that communication channels remain open at all times and that the relationship with the tenant remains good. There may be reasons why over time the tenant may decide not to communicate or respond to you in a timely manner and eventually stop allowing you access to the property, which is their right to do so, as we'll come on to and have a look at in a little moment. Now, there are many reasons why the tenant might decide to stop allowing you access to your property. First of all, they might have fallen out with you over something. So, for example, has their rent been late? You've had to chase them. Have you had to have words with them about the cleanliness, for example, of the property? And they've simply taken a bit of a dislike to you. Is there something going on in their life, some other stressor that you don't necessarily know about, and therefore they don't really want to take the time and effort to communicate with you and just simply stop? It might be something more serious. So, for example, they might have moved somebody into the property without telling you. They might have, sublet a room or moved somebody else in breach of their tenancy contract. They might potentially have got a pet as well, again, without asking your permission. If you have an apartment, for example, it's very likely that the lease says no animals, no pets are allowed. So they may want to hide this from you and don't want you or anybody else round to the property to discover what they've done. They may have made some changes to the property, and they may have redecorated without your permission. They may have damaged something in the property, and again, they don't want to tell you about it. Either they're scared that you are going to evict them, or they can't afford to repair it, and therefore they don't want to even broach the subject with you. Even more seriously, they might be engaged in criminal activities. The most obvious one that springs to mind is growing cannabis. This is not uncommon in rental properties and might be a reason why a tenant is now refusing access to the property. But don't forget, as a landlord and a property owner, you do have a statutory duty to carry out maintenance visits. Now, I also mentioned the tenant has the legal right to refuse access as well. So the tenant has something called a covenant to quiet enjoyment. This is a technical term which essentially means the tenant has the right to the privacy in the property. Once you have entered into a tenancy agreement with a tenant, the property is still legally yours. However, it now becomes their home and they can decide who to permit access to and when. Now, technically, these laws are in conflict, and it's only by looking at case law and precedent that we can see that the tenant's covenant to quiet enjoyment overrides the landlord's statutory duty for access for maintenance visits. And we can see this through case law, and also particularly in the social housing sector, where tenants may refuse access, for example, to the gas engineer, and the landlord or the agent then needs to go to court and get an injunction order in order to be able to access the property to carry out this legal inspection. So as we can see, the tenant's covenant for quiet enjoyment is really important here. You can't simply access the property simply by giving them notice and then turning up. You can't barge your way in. If you do so, you can face both criminal and civil prosecutions here. So not only could you be criminally prosecuted, but you can face civil fines as well and penalties. So it is really serious. Ideally, you don't want to have to get to the point where you need a court injunction to enter your property. So this is where making an effort to maintain a good relationship with your tenant comes in, keeping communication channels open, trying to understand things from their perspective. You might need to be a little bit more flexible than you otherwise might be standard across your portfolio. So for example, you might need to ask your gas engineer or your electrician to attend out of hours, for example, evenings and weekends. The tenant might insist that they be there when the contractor arrives, and if they're at work, again, you know, that is their prerogative to do so. So it might be that you and your contractors, as I say, need to be a little bit more flexible in order to gain access to the property. Now, it's really important that you set the tenant's expectations early on. So as part of our application process, we do talk to potential tenants about maintenance visits, about access to the property, about their responsibility for reporting any minor maintenance issues. We also want to make sure that we keep on top of these minor maintenance issues before they become more serious and more expensive issues that the landlord or property owner then needs to deal with. If the tenant does start being unresponsive and deliberately preventing access to the property, then it's time to start documenting this process as well. You need to document when you have contacted the tenant, what you have requested, how much time in terms of advance notice of access you have requested. It's also then important to document the tenant's response. So chatting by phone is great, but once you've had a phone call, make a note of the time and date and the content of the phone call, and ideally follow this up by email so that you have something in writing. If it goes to court, you absolutely need written evidence. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen, basically. You can't evidence that it happened. It's your word against theirs. It needs to be documented. So record keeping at this point of the process is absolutely essential. You can have potentially an escalation process here as well. So documenting the first refusal for access, then sending another letter more forcefully requesting access, and then eventually the third letter potentially threatening the obtaining of a court injunction in order to be able to enter the property, whether that to carry out a gas safety inspection or to carry out some other maintenance repair work that might be needed in order to protect the fabric of the building. Now, ideally, you don't want to get to this point, but that is the ultimate sanction that you need to follow in order to gain access to your property for maintenance and legal inspections. Now, if you do get to the point of having to issue a court injunction, I would suggest that this tenant is not your ideal tenant and you don't want them in the property long term. You want somebody who not only pays the rent but looks after the property for you. Remember, this is a valuable asset and it's their home. They should be taking care and pride in the home, and you want to make sure that the asset value is maintained and increased over the long term. Therefore, in the current environment, the ultimate sanction at this point is to issue a Section 21 notice in order to regain possession of your property. So in summary, I hope these points have helped indicate the importance of you carrying out regular maintenance visits and keeping communication channels open with your tenant to allow contractors access to the property, but also what to do if things deteriorate and your tenant is deliberately preventing you access to your property.